All right, so we continue with our discussion of software project management and organization. And we transition into Unit 2, where we get to look at project planning, essentially. All right. So this whole notion or idea of project planning essentially involves breaking down the work activities associated with the project into their constituent parts or units, right? And if you remember in the previous unit, we introduced this whole notion of breaking up a project into activities and then subsequently into tasks, right? A task will essentially be a work unit, smallest possible work unit that can be associated with your project. But not only that, we also introduced this whole notion of roles within a project, right? So we made mention of the fact that you would typically come up with roles or project roles and then assign those roles to project team members. So if you have a team composed of 4 members and you know that you're going to have to collect requirements and do the design, perhaps do a bit of testing and implementation, then what you'd have to do is come up with different roles associated with all those key activities. Then what you do is amongst the 4 project team members, you assign specific roles to those individuals. So perhaps participant or team member A would be assigned the implementer role. Participants is it 2 and 3 or B and C would be assigned the designer role and perhaps the tester role, right? And so the assignment of these things we're calling parts or tasks would be assigned to the roles, and then participants are attached to the roles. So the other thing that you end up, and I'll switch this off, the other thing that you definitely end up doing during project planning is really to anticipate anticipate potential problems that could manifest themselves during the course of the project. So anything that you think could hinder the overall success of the project needs to be noted down. But not just noting down potential problems, you want to come up with strategies or workarounds that you could use to solve those problems as they occur, right? Usually this process of identification of problems and tentative solutions is loosely tied to risk management. So you identify risks and then you come up with a strategy or risk mitigations. So things that you'd otherwise utilize to minimize those risks or cut down on the potential risks. So the initial project plan that is created at the inception of the project is, for the most part, the one used to communicate on how the work will be done to the project team and the customers, right? And it's in fact this master blueprint that you use to assess the overall overall progress of the project, right? So the plan is not only used to break down the different activities associated with the project into smaller manageable chunks, but it's also used to identify potential problems that might occur, the workarounds. It's used to communicate how work is going to be done, and then it also is used to assess the overall progress of the project. All right, so in terms of the different planning stages here, obviously the initial stage is the proposal stage, and what you typically tend to do at the proposal stage is you'd probably be bidding for a tender that you might have come across in the newspapers, for instance, right? You could think of this bidding process to be somewhat related to the process you guys went through when you were selecting, when your respective project teams were selecting which topics they wanted to work on, right? So it was like a bidding process, obviously, although a rather informal bidding process that we went through. And so part of the bidding process is you're trying to justify why you should be awarded the contract to develop the software platform or system. On the startup phase, of course, this comes immediately after the proposal stage, right? So you've been awarded the contract to implement this software platform or system. You go through a so-called project startup phase where you come up with a plan on who exactly is going to form the project team, and how the project is going to be broken down into different parts, how the different resources will be allocated throughout your company, right? And remember here, whenever we are mentioning resources, we are making reference to things as human beings or people hired to work on the project, hardware resources that you might need for you to successfully execute the project, software components, case tools, right? These all fall under resources. And so, but the important thing here is that throughout the course of the project, what you tend to do is you modify the plan, right? As you gain more in-depth understanding of what the project is all about. Because you have to understand that once you start working on the project, there are bound to be a lot of things that wouldn't immediately be clear, right? But as you progress, more and more information becomes more clear, and so you have to periodically modify the plan to take into account your firm understanding of the project. So in terms of the proposal planning, and this is going to be really important because one of the very next assignments coming your way is to do with proposal writing, right? As part of the proposal planning process, it might be necessary for you to just briefly outline some of the key software requirements associated with the project, right? You remember at this stage, you would not have already gone through the requirements engineering process, but you'd have an idea as to what the customer might be looking for, right? Case in point, those topics that you selected, even though we have not, or you have not gone through a thorough requirements engineering process, you already have an idea as to what sort of software application or system you're going to have to implement as a group, right? But really the aim of the planning at the proposal stage is just to provide sufficient information that is in part going to be used to come up with a realistic price tag for the system, right? In your proposal, when you're bidding for a contract, you'd have to tell the customer how much money you're expecting to be paid once you deliver the product, right? And so obviously, you need some sort of input information for you to come up with that pricing information. All right. The pricing obviously involves, again, part of the proposal. Pricing would typically involve you coming up with an estimate, right? So how many people do you think you would need for you to develop the piece of software? How many people do you think you'd need for you to come up with the documentation if you're going to need a different set of individuals? If you need to hire people to do the design of the software, how many people are you going to need? So these would all fall under staff costs. What sort of hardware would you need? Are you going to need certain specialist software tools and components, case tools, right? Are you going to have to make a subscription to Lucid Charts, or do you need some really fancy wireframing application, right? That would typically cost money. If that's the case, all of these things need to be taken into account when trying to estimate the price, right? And then the estimate is what you really tag as your price, right? When bidding for the project, for the contract, right? So after proposal planning, obviously you go through a startup planning phase or process. And really the assumption we're making here is that after the bidding process at proposal stage, you're awarded the contract, right? So you're given a go ahead to say, yes, out of the other people that bid for the project, we think that you're a perfect match for this. So you go through a startup planning process. By then you'd have already known slightly more, right? You'd have acquired slightly more information because you'd have once the contract is awarded to you, obviously one of the things you do is you hold formal and informal meetings with your customers or potential clients for you to gain a firm sense of what the project is all about. And so you'd have acquired some system requirements associated with the project, right? But then key thing here is you'd not have undergone the design and implementation phase, or rather you would not have acquired sufficient information that would feed into the design and implementation phase. The key thing here for startup planning is you just want to create a plan that has just enough details necessary for you to make important decisions about the project budget and staffing, right? Remember, these things that the cost that you're coming up with is just an estimate. During startup planning, you want to come up with a more comprehensive budget, right? And cost plan associated with staffing. And really, the startup plan is what forms the basis for resource allocation to the project, right? At this stage, you would have decided, if you came up with an estimate to say you need 4 developers here, maybe at this stage you'd have firmly decided to say, oh, maybe in actual fact what we need is just 2 developers or 3 developers. It should be enough for us to successfully implement this software project. Right, and then again, what the startup plan does is it provides you with a basis to set up monitoring mechanisms, right? Remember, we introduced the concept of process improvement in the previous lecture series, right? You need to set up mechanisms in place to be able to monitor the relative success or progress of the project. Right, so, but again, in case you're wondering, I mean, so startup planning is not just applicable to the traditional software development model, right? AKA the waterfall model, but it's also needed for more agile-centric development processes, right? Because you still need to allocate resources to the project. All right, and then also finally here, you probably need a development plan, the actual development plan. Again, this development plan would need to be constantly amended as you progress through the project, because you're slowly acquiring more information about the software that you're implementing and associated development processes. Again, key thing here is that it's not just the plan that needs to be constantly revised, right? You also need to constantly revise your project schedule, the timelines, and the money, the cost estimates. And also you want to regularly go through your list of risks that you'd have identified and make revisions where necessary. We actually discuss in depth project schedules, different cost estimation techniques and risk management in this particular lecture series. Just thought it would be important for us to reiterate, right, the fact that these different plans we're talking about are not a substitute for the more specific plans that you need to devise throughout the course of the project, right? Some of these things might be familiar, some of them not. I know V&V planning should be familiar because we discussed this in lecture series number 2, right? Remember, we introduced this whole notion of testing, right? If you remember, we touched on things like unit test and acceptance testing. You just don't wake up and decide to say you're going to conduct unit testing or acceptance testing. You need a comprehensive plan on how you're going to do that. Clearly stipulated steps and procedures that are going to be performed, right? Planning, all that feeds into the V&V planning, so verification and validation plans. But other plans that you might need to come up with are configuration management plans, right? Essentially spelling out the different procedures, management procedures and structures associated with the project. Development plan. Once you are done implementing this software system and you test it and the customer is happy, it needs to be deployed so that the customer starts using it, right? you need to come out, or you need to come up or clearly spell out exactly how the deployment is going to be done, right? So this is tied to the development plan. You of course need a maintenance plan, depending on the type of contract that you would have signed with the customers, the software customers or clients. It might be the case that maybe they'll pay a subscription, maybe an annual subscription, for you to regularly maintain the piece of software, right? This is tied to the evolution phase of the SDLC, the software development lifecycle, right? So you need a plan for that. And part of what feeds into this plan here is you want to anticipate what sort of maintenance requirements will come your way, the cost involved and the effort, right? So you deploy the system. It's not like you shake hands with a customer and then you go your separate ways. No. There are problems that might occur as the customers use a software platform or system that you'd have deployed. And so you need to come up with a plan on how you're going to potentially interact with the customer for them to raise issues or problems, for them to approach you if there are bug fixes that are required, right? Or if there are feature enhancements. All that is tied to maintenance, right? And of course, you need to come up with a quality plan, right? Remember when we introduced this triple constraint, the idea behind the triple constraint, so quality, cost, and time, we mentioned that this issue of quality is extremely important, more especially for mission critical applications or systems, and in fact, systems that are used in domains such as the health sector, right? So you need a quality plan, right? Where you more or less like come up with checklists on what sort of standards need to be met insofar as the development of the software is concerned, for instance. And then finally, like I said, the validation and verification and validation plan, really. All right, so next up is going to be plan-driven development.